This really is 5 minutes to midnight for Europe. That was the assessment today of Germany's chancellor-in-waiting, Friedrich Merz, as he put European security at the top of his agenda after winning the country's election. And he has wasted no time in outlining why, pointing to indifference from Washington and raising questions about the future of NATO. Now Donald Trump is in the White House. He made these comments last night during a TV debate that appeared to signal a seismic shift in transatlantic relations. Take a listen.
After Donald Trump's statements last week, it is clear that the Americans, or this administration, are largely indifferent to the fate of Europe. I'm very curious to see how we are heading toward the NATO summit at the end of June, whether we will still be talking about NATO in its current form, or whether we will have to establish a European defense capability. That's my absolute priority.
The US president did offer his congratulations to Germany's conservatives, describing their election win as a great day. But there was no mention of Friedrich Merz by name in the message posted by Donald Trump on his Truth Social platform. Instead, he described the win as vindication for his own populist political movement, claiming Germany got tired of the no common sense agenda. And when questioned today about Trump, Merz had this to say.
Our message is very clear and straightforward. We are very much interested, as Europeans, to have a good relationship with the US and maintain this. We see ourselves as partners. We see the US as an important part of NATO. The EU is also an important part of NATO. We're in a political alliance. It's not just a military alliance. It is a political alliance as well.
Merz's comments about NATO and European independence are being reported in Europe. The online news outlet Politico says Germany's Merz vows independence from Trump's America, warning NATO may soon be dead. And France's Le Monde says Germany's Merz calls for strong transatlantic ties, but ready for worst-case scenario. We have two guests to talk about this. Kristina Spohr, Professor of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science and an expert on German history and statescraft. And we're joined by Joshua Shifrinson, Associate Professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Thanks to both of you so much for joining us. Let me start with you, Kristina. Is Friedrich Merz right to publicly question NATO's future, to call for Europe to be more independent from the US?
I actually think we have to remember that what you just highlight is what he said last night. And today already he has come out and emphasized, of course, how much from a European perspective there's a great desire to keep the alliance going, that the alliance itself per se is functioning very well. But of course, that Germany has a great interest to keep the bilateral relationship with the United States and within NATO on track. I mean, after all, from a European perspective, of course, America is the empire by invitation, and that invitation, of course, is still standing. What he's highlighting is that America first may mean America alone, and a show of disinterest from the Trump administration towards Europe.
Joshua, what's your take? Are we approaching potentially a pivotal moment where Germany abandons its decades-old policy of aligning itself with the US?
Well, I don't think the question is Germany seeking to abandon the alliance. I think Kristina was spot on in saying that Germany really values the transatlantic relationship. I think the question really is whether the United States is going to retain its historic interest in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And there, I think there are both domestic headwinds in the U.S. as well as strategic headwinds outside of Europe, outside of the United States, that are pushing the U.S. away from Europe, and in turn may compel Germany, France, and other members of the alliance, other European members of the alliance, to seek to carve out a more autonomous European identity, either within NATO or via the EU or some other institutional apparatus.
One of your publications is titled A Post-American Europe. It's time for Washington to Europeanize NATO and give up responsibility for the continent's security. So explain to us a little more that why doing that would actually be good for the US.
Well, so we have to remember that the U.S. interest in Europe historically is not a positive one. That is to say, it has an anti-hegemonic impulse. It seeks to prevent a European hegemon from emerging. This drove the U.S. to intervene in the First and Second World Wars, and it led the U.S. to support NATO when the Cold War threatened Soviet hegemony on the continent. Since the end of the Cold War, there hasn't been a hegemonic threat to the continent of Europe. Indeed, even today, the Russian assault on Ukraine has revealed that Russia, although it may hold hegemonic ambitions, lacks the capability to be a continental hegemon. As a result, if there's no hegemonic threat, the United States, operating in a world of scarcity with their domestic demands on American time and resources, strategic demands on American time and resources, ought to reconsider whether retaining its commitment to NATO is actually in the U.S. interest. And my co-author and I came to the conclusion that there are reasons to say this has been a success story thus far, and it's time for the U.S. to focus on areas of the world where the U.S. has not had such success. And as a result, question the American commitment to NATO going forward. This was, of course, written before the Trump administration. But I think the analysis holds regardless of who's in the Oval Office.
Friedrich Merz is known as being an Atlanticist. He's worked for American companies. Kristina, are his comments about the need for European independence from the U.S. therefore surprising? Did you ever think that you would hear him say that?
As I said before, I mean, the point really is that it's America that is looking to withdraw or that is showing less interest. I think Germany and the Europeans are very interested. I also think there's something else to highlight. It is not just a question of power and, of course, this issue that if you look simply on the map, that Russia is a Eurasian power and by default is always the strongest on the continent unless you have a counterbalance with the United States as a European power, which it has been ever since it ditched its isolationism in the aftermath and then stayed in the aftermath of the Second World War. I think there's also a very strong normative and principled ideational point to make, namely that both the UN Charter, and we just saw this today in the UN vote for the resolution where actually America abstained and the Europeans got their amendment through, that certain principles do matter. Territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence, freedom of choice of alliance. And of course, America used to be the beacon of those principles of open society, freedom, democracy, and market economy. And we also have to remember FDR and the four freedoms. And I think what we are seeing is not just America may have other interests elsewhere. It's also simply ditching something that it has been standing for since the end of World War II. So I think there's much bigger things at stake, which this current administration is completely throwing away, which is more valuable than just power politics.
The former German Chancellor Angela Merkel famously had a difficult relationship with Donald Trump during his first term. What dynamic do you expect, Kristina, between the next German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, and Donald Trump, given that Merz has said things like, I mean, he's likened US intervention in Germany's election to Russian interference. So how do you think Trump and Merz are going to get on?
Absolutely. I think it will be quite a testy relationship, although we have to remember that, you said that Merkel was frosty with Trump. Of course, she perceived him as rather emotional, a man full of grievances and neediness, who works in this emotional kind of way, whether she takes a very sort of pragmatic, scientific approach to things. And she figured out fairly quickly that, as she said, she wasn't really dealing with a completely ordinary human being. I think also with Merz, we will have a sort of man and man relationship. And I think it will be testy because both are quite tough guys. So we will see how that pans out once they actually have a meeting. But I mean, obviously, a normal statesman who applies diplomacy will try to see how far you can go. But I think Friedrich Merz will also stand firm and draw his lines. And the same will go for if there's a coalition, were there to be a coalition with SPD and were there to be a defense minister Pistorius. I think things will be, from the German perspective, pretty straightforward and straight talking how things are going to be spelled out. As actually Steinmeier said today in Kiev, there are certain things that have to be spelled out how they are. Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe stands with Ukraine and for the principles. And they actually expect that from the United States as well.
Frank-Walter Steinmeier, of course, being the German president. I just wanted to talk about something that Alice Weidel, the head of Germany's far-right AfD party, said. She's been speaking about Germany's role in the world. I'd like to get both of your reactions. So let's take a quick listen to what she said.
Nobody takes us seriously on the international stage anymore. That's why we no longer sit at the negotiating table anywhere, and we have to change that. We are the point of contact for our foreign partners, for our international partners on the international stage.
Kristina, what do you make of Alice Weidel's comments there? How is Germany seen on the world stage, both by the US and by others?
First of all, we have to remember Germany is the world economic power number 3 to this day. Germany is also one of the strongest supporters of aid to the Ukraine. And if you look at the latest figures, Europe has given many more billions of dollars of money to Ukraine, both in humanitarian and financial aid and military aid than the United States. Europe has overtaken the United States. So, I think Alice Weidel is actually completely mistaken in what she's saying. And we see this also how Europe is pulling together Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and the Germans, and together, of course, with the Nordic and Baltic bloc in particular over this aspect of securing Europe's domain.
Mm-hmm. Joshua, what do you think?
Well, I agree with Kristina's point that Germany is an economic powerhouse, that it is a major point of contact upon the continent. Where I think the AfD head may be a little correct, although I certainly do not support her platform, is it's very clear that during the war in Ukraine, Germany has shown that it lacks the military capability, the enduring military production capability to provide security upon the continent, as Germany long sought to do and even did during the Cold War. And I think if Germany were to step up a bit more in the security space and actually develop the hard capabilities needed to help provide security upon the continent, then I think Germany would have a larger voice in international and European affairs. And at a time when there's a question over how durable the American commitment is to Europe, this could be a centerpiece for a more enduring and capable Europe. Obviously, the AfD has a different vision for what Germany should stand for in the world. I think there are great questions over that vision. But the notion that Germany needs to do more, should do more, can do more in the security space, can step up more on the international stage, I think has a point to it.
Joshua, are you afraid, or do you see the likelihood that by Europe taking on more responsibility for its own security, that the US could become weaker because, of course, it has to deal with challenges from China and Russia and would then be doing that completely on its own? What do you think of that perspective?
Well, I hear that perspective. I don't think that's entirely the right question, though, or necessarily the right framework. Again, the American interest in Europe is to prevent a hegemon from emerging. And in that sense, the U.S. is perfectly fine if Europe steps up and does more for the continent. But to the question of what Europe provides the United States, look, the U.S. has long had economic relations with European countries outside, within NATO, beyond NATO, and everything in between. The U.S. Can certainly call upon allies in the Indo-Pacific, even in South America, Latin America, to tackle the China challenge. And so far as Europe is necessary to handle the security, the strategic, the foreign policy issues of the day, be it on climate change, be it on AI, be it on economic affairs or security affairs, it's not clear that NATO, which is ultimately a European-centered outfit, provides much to the United States in the broader spectrum of what the U.S. focuses upon. So I don't think the U.S. changing its position vis-a-vis Europe leads to a weaker United States. It leads to a more complicated diplomatic map, but that doesn't necessarily mean a weaker United States.
This is the final question to both of you. Is Germany turning against the United States, or is essentially doing what it needs to do in this potentially new world order? Joshua first, if you would.
Is Germany turning against the United States? No, I don't think so. I think what we've underlined in this conversation, that Germany remains very open to a transatlantic relationship, to a conversation with the United States. The problem is the United States itself seems to be unwilling and perhaps unable to play the traditional role in Europe, and that's injecting a degree of uncertainty, a degree of tension to the relationship, the likes of which we haven't seen in 30, perhaps 70 some odd years. And so Germany isn't turning against the United States, but in this new strategic environment, this new economic environment, this new political environment, there are just transatlantic tensions, and it's possible there could be a NATO crack-up.
Kristina, your thoughts?
I think we are seeing also the reassertion of Germany and the European states in general, because I think we really have to remember this other point I made before, that what at stake is not just geopolitics, power politics and economics, but actually also the way of life. And the way of life means a sustainable democracy. And what we see with the United States is that the United States has turned away from some of the key principles that, of course, are at the heart of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but principles that are also part of the Helsinki Final Act and principles that are also part of the United Nations Charter. And I think what is much more dangerous in terms of the world order per se and the liberal order as we know is when one of the biggest powers is turning away from the very principles it was standing up for in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the world fought against the Nazis, or the free world fought against the Nazis at this very moment in time.
Kristina Spohr from the London School of Economics and Joshua Shifrinson from the University of Maryland. Thank you so much to you both for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.